All right, well, it's time for our guest speaker, and I'm happy to introduce you to Adam Carter. Adam is the Global Vice President of Finance for both the beverage and consumer mills business at WestRock, which represents nearly $3.5 billion in sales and over 20 manufacturing locations in the US, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Adam is a double University of Virginia graduate with a BA in history and an MBA from the Darden School. He has previous experience in strategic communications, both in the public and private sectors, and entered the finance world in 2006 at Mead Westvaco, serving in various functions over the last 10 years, including serving as the Director of Commercial Excellence and the CFO of Latin America while stationed in Campinas, Brazil, which I think you're going to hear about now. I've known this guy a long time. You were actually in my wedding, I think?
Yep.
I wasn't in your wedding. What happened there?
No. It was in Peru.
It was in Peru. That made it awkward. Great guy. A lot of interesting experience. I visited him while he was in Brazil and was learning about what was going on while he was there, and just totally fascinating. So I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Adam.
Thank you, Matt. And full disclosure, there are no wedding parties in Peruvian weddings, so there are no groomsmen or bridesmaids.
Oh, okay. That's the excuse.
That's the excuse.
Didn't make the cut.
All right, well, listen, thanks so much. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everybody, for the opportunity to chat with you. So Matt gave a bit of an overview of my professional experience. I started out actually in politics, worked in politics for several years before going back to business school, and then have basically spent most of my time since business school at Mead Westvaco and now WestRock. So it's a global packaging company that's, Mead Westvaco originally was headquartered here. We merged about 2 years ago with a company in Atlanta called Rock 10, and the new company is WestRock. It's been a great experience. Never thought I would be in the paper and packaging industry for 10 years, but have really enjoyed it and have gotten to travel to some wonderful places and live some wonderful places. So what I'm going to talk about today is an experience I had when I was in Brazil. So I spent 5 years living and working in Brazil. Went down for a 3-year expat assignment that turned into 5. Had a great time and had a couple of different roles that Matt described. The role I'm going to talk about here was my first role when I got down there. And it was a really unique experience to try to drive change in a complicated situation for a variety of reasons, but one that ultimately taught me a lot about myself as well as kind of how to manage a project like this. So what I'm going to show you, the first few slides I'm going to show you are actually slides from an investor presentation that we gave to our largest investor when she came down to visit us in Brazil in 2012. I had arrived in 2010 at the launch of this project. So by this time, the project was about 2 years underway, but it gives you a little bit of context about what the situation was in Brazil, and then I can talk a little bit about the situation itself. So MWV at that time was about a $6 billion in sales company, global, but with a fairly large operation in Brazil. We were in packaging, consumer and office products, specialty chemicals, and community and land development, but the focus really was packaging. MWV Regesa was the name of the Brazilian subsidiary that I worked for. So represented about, a tenth or so of the overall sales of the company. Mead Westvaco, actually Westvaco, had purchased the original Brazilian entity in the 50s, and so had 60 years of experience kind of working in Brazil, knew the culture, knew the environment, and had built a very successful business over time. The business that we are in down there is the corrugated box business, and so we have what's called a fully integrated business. We own 134,000 acres of forest land where we grow trees, and we do genetic we focus on the genetics to try to make our trees grow better and faster. We have a large paper mill, and then we have corrugated box plants. So we make the typical Amazon.com corrugated boxes down there. Second largest player in the market, and a very, very profitable part of the Westvaco portfolio, or Mead Westvaco portfolio at that point. what we saw in Brazil in 2010 was, if y'all remember, it was right at the point where Brazil was starting to take off. They had just announced that Brazil was going to host the World Cup. Everybody was very, very excited about the growth that was coming in Brazil, and so there was a tremendous amount of focus on the country in terms of an opportunity for growth. The corrugated box market that we participated in was fairly fragmented, but both from a competitor standpoint and from a customer standpoint. And that's important because one of the things that we were tasked to do as part of this investment in Brazil that I'm going to talk about was to try to go out and grow our business and steal, quote unquote, win business from our competitors. The challenge that we had was one of, we had very large positions in really the places where we wanted to play, and we had built those positions over many, many years, but we had kind of tapped out in terms of where we could reach in terms of the wallet share within those customers. And so the challenge was we were going to invest about $500 million in a new paper machine, and the question was, how can we grow that downstream business and do it in a way that the board of directors could feel comfortable that, hey, we're going to invest $500 million in an increase in capacity for this market. Show us that you have the ability to actually take that paper and turn it into boxes, because that's where you really make the money. It goes without saying that this was an extremely high-profile project. It was something we talked about publicly on our earnings calls. It was, I think it was the single largest investment the company had made in more than 2 decades, and it was very high-profile, and it was. But there was a lot of excitement and energy around it because we really felt like it was something that was going to have a step change in terms of the profitability of the Brazilian business. I picked these charts because these are the charts that we used when we talked to our investors and when we talked to our board about the project. All the lines are going up, right? So the expectation is we're going to make an investment and we're going to drive increased EBITDA, we're going to drive increased sales, and we're going to grow this business. The bottom right is a picture of the actual infrastructure that we were putting in. It just gives you a feel for the size and scope of the investment. The white part was the existing paper mill. We were putting in a new paper machine, so we were basically more than doubling our capacity. And the blue part was all the new investments. And so it was a very, very exciting time to be there, but it was a time that brought with it a lot of expectations. The Brazilian business was one where we really, really focused on our core capabilities of commercial excellence as something that we felt differentiated ourselves in the market. And this was a slide that we put together that was a case study with one of our customers that showed how our corrugated box solutions could really bring savings to their supply chain. And we did it through a number of things. We said we had better insights into our customers' operations because we spent time on the floor. We talked about our expertise in product development. Our box quality, our paper quality. These were all the kind of aspects of our value proposition that we felt pretty strongly about. We felt like we had a track record that gave us the confidence that we could grow the business to support this investment. What's really interesting is this was pulled together by some consultants that we had sent down, and as I talked to them as I was planning for my arrival to Brazil, I said, this is great. It feels like this should be really, really easy. They got the blueprint. We'll just go out and execute it, right? Everybody kind of uses this playbook when they go out every day and sell. And the guy was like, not even close. He said, it took 2 weeks of meetings for us to kind of pick this out of people's brains, because what this was exactly what people did and how we ran the business. But there was no playbook. It was just kind of in the DNA, and it had been built into the DNA over the 60 years of operating in the country and the training from one generation of salespeople to the next. We had a couple of guys that were just the wizards that kind of had literally started in the business when they were 14, 15 years old, you know, running stuff from one office to the other after school, and had grown up to lead the sales team. So they knew how to do it, and the organization knew how to do it, but there was no playbook that said, all right, you arrive day one, sales guy, this is what you do, and these are the tools that you need. And so I was brought in to basically help drive that structure and help say, let's take all of these really good things that we do, that we've built this really strong business based on, and let's try to both capture it, leverage it, and then replicate it and allow us to use it to drive our growth. It was a great opportunity. It was a brand new role, so the role had never existed before. This was a business that was not used to having expats come in, so there would typically be maybe one expat there at any given time. It was usually the president or maybe the second in command. But certainly not someone kind of coming in, you know, more in the middle of the organization. I had no experience in any kind of commercial role. So as Matt said, I'd been a finance guy, I'd been a strategy guy, I'd worked in communications. I was given this opportunity, I think, partially because I was willing to go. You know, my wife was from Peru, our kids were young at that point. It was a great opportunity for them to experience the culture. And I had a fairly good view of the organization here in the U.S., and I knew I could be a kind of a touch point back. But it was, I also will tell you, I was really, really excited, but I certainly didn't know what I was getting into. So I arrived January 2nd, 2010 into a role, really not knowing very much about the country, knowing generally what I had to try to get accomplished. But really also with a blank slate, which was exciting and energizing, and we had good support from our teams, but a little bit scary. So what did I find when I got there? You know, it was a really, really successful business run by an experienced, very professional team. So the thing that was really positive was this 60 years of being part of Westvaco and then Midwest Vaco. The things that you typically find in a U.S. multinational in terms of structure and good ethics and good training, those things existed, and the team was very well formed, and they had good retention. They didn't lose people. People literally worked there for decades. Deep markets of the deep knowledge of the markets and customers. We didn't spend a lot of time on the customer slide, but we played across a whole bunch of different markets. So, you know, fresh fruit boxes that go to Costco, or you know, boxes for crackers or meats or flours or bulk boxes of chemicals. Played across a lot of markets, but had real deep knowledge of the niches where we played. There was this inherent know-how, this tribal knowledge that was built into the DNA. That was great. So arriving there and having to teach that, I think, would have been very, very difficult. Arriving there and trying to have to pull it out was a lot easier because it existed. And they had a really strong track record of growth and profits, right? And so this was a confident team. And they were incredibly confident in their own abilities, so much so that it made it really hard when you're trying to go in and teach them something new, right? The guy from the U.S. coming down who doesn't, frankly, speak Portuguese, trying to say, hey, this is what you should do. It's like, all right, you know, we'll wait you out and you'll go home, and we won't have to worry about you anymore. The challenges I've talked about a little bit already. The experience was really passed down but not written down. So everybody knew what they were supposed to do. They hired young folks right out of school and trained them up, but it wasn't captured anywhere. So when we look at saying we're going to grow our business by 50%, you can't use your existing sales force that you've had half a dozen years to train to do that. You've got to, you know, if not grow your sales force by 50%, certainly grow it by something more than what it was. The organization had really been on an island for a lot of years, so it was both good and bad. It was very isolated, partially because of language, but partially just because of distance. And so there had not been a lot of interaction with the U.S. The thing that was really great about it was the people had developed their own kind of best practices, and they developed this real positive culture, but they weren't used to kind of constant visitors and constant influence from the U.S. they were the best performer in the business in the company, and they knew it, right? There was confidence, maybe a little bit of arrogance, well-earned, well-deserved. They were getting $500 million of investment. But it makes it harder to come in and drive change versus a business that's on the ropes and that's really reaching out for help. They had kind of put forth a plan, gotten the money, and then all of a sudden, gosh, all these helpers are coming in. And so, how do we do with that? Overall, we needed confidence that it would be executed. So it was a really big investment. It was a bet the company type investment, and it was really important that the folks in Richmond could have confidence that we were going to execute it and execute it well. And there's one other thing that was a challenge. Nobody spoke English. Nobody. So beyond literally the 2 or 3 senior leaders at the top of the organization, there was no English skills. Sales managers, sales directors, minimal at best to nothing. And so I didn't speak Portuguese at that point. I had to learn pretty quickly. But that challenge was something that I didn't totally appreciate until I got down there. What's interesting is that actually ended up turning into something that I think led me to have greater success than if everybody had spoken English. And I'll tell you why in a minute. So how it evolved. So I would like to say that I arrived and I had a big change management plan. I knew exactly what I was going to do, and I was going to go through step 1, 2, 3. I'd read Cotter when I was in business school, but I didn't. I got there and I was excited. I was living in Brazil. It was warm. It was beautiful. And I kind of started hanging out at the plant and learning about it. And I realized, oh my gosh, I can understand what these people say because I spoke some Spanish, but I can't sit down with, the old dinosaur sales manager who's really going to be the key person to convince and have a conversation with them about why this is a good idea. So I said, the first thing I thought was, oh my gosh, I need help. And so I immediately called back to Richmond and I said, send me somebody down. And Ergus, whose name is there, was part of what we had at that point was a rotational MBA program. So Ergus was a year and a half out of school. He's from Albania. He had grown up listening to Italian TV from Albania, and so he kind of had a working knowledge of Italian. So we thought that he could learn Portuguese fairly quickly. I called up HR and I said, send me somebody down here. I need them as fast as you can. And they said, we can get Ergus down there in 6 weeks. I said, great. So I got Ergus down, and he had run a similar play at a different rotation here in the US. And I knew him and I trusted him, and he was super smart and he worked really hard. And I said, Ergus, this is what we need you to do. We need you to build a value proposition model for our salespeople that we can use to go out and drive these incremental sales. And I said, let's pick one of the. We're in 15 different segments. We got to pick one. We got to pick one and we got to drive it to the ground, and then hopefully it'll actually play out the way we think it will, and then we can use that to convince the rest of the organization. And so I literally stuck him in this box plant, and in this small town in the state of Sao Paulo, where I also had an office, and I said, make this happen. And he was going to be there for 6 months. And God bless him, I had been there for two months struggling with Portuguese, trying to learn it. He went into that team and he said, I don't want to speak any English. He said, you guys speak to me in Portuguese, and I'm going to kind of muddle through it, and we're going to work on this together. And he really helped drive it. And we picked a case study, and it was fruit and farmers in the rural countryside of Brazil. And we ran tests, and he went out there and talked to the farmers, and we proved out the value proposition, and it was a huge success. And then, 2 months after he had arrived, he was speaking much better Portuguese than I, so we got into a little bit of competition there. But it was really key to have somebody who could go in and help drive that change. He left shortly thereafter. He only had 6 months where he could go, and then I was by myself again. But the infrastructure had been set up, and we had trained a couple young folks in the organization that could then pick it up and go with it. I then about 6 months later, I said, all right, I need somebody to help take this case study and drive it into a process that we can replicate and blow out across all the box plants. And so that's when I found Filigoy. So Filigoy, his name is Jose Filigoy. He was the best sales guy in the company. He owned the 2 biggest accounts. These were his accounts. One guy covering, probably $75 million worth of business. And he had driven tremendous success. This case study was something that Filigoy did. So he did this when he was leading the Cydia account. And so he knew it, and he also had the confidence of the team, right? He had also started on the plant floor when he was 17 years old, had worked on the corrugator, had worked his way up, and then worked his way up into a kind of a mid-level, high-level sales position, low-level sales manager position, and he was also ambitious as anything. Like, he wanted to be a manager, and that was like a huge deal for him. So I hired him as my commercial excellence manager, and I said, all right, Filigoy, you're going to take this thing that Ergus developed, and you're going to blow out this into a process, and you got to convince your 75 fellow salespeople in Brazil that this is the right way to go. And it worked. It worked, and he helped develop the structure, and he helped sell the process internally, and that was huge. The other thing we did is we leveraged what existed. I said we made the old new again. They were doing this already. And when I went in and started to have the conversations with the sales leadership, I said, guys, all I want to do is take what you do and just write it down on paper, pick one thing from one side, one thing from another, and it's going to be, don't worry, it's not going to be something from the U.S. It's going to be the Rajasa way. We're just going to package it up and make it look like something coming out of the U.S. And that was big because they felt like, all right, this guy's not coming to try to force something down on me. He's recognizing the benefit of what I do. He's recognizing that we have a good business. And in Brazil and in a lot of countries, the relationships are really, really important. So it was literally, sitting down with these guys in their office, going out for a beer, talking them through it as well as I could in my broken Portuguese and their broken English to try to help convince them this is what we needed to do. This was the thing that was really key about the English. We made it local, right? So I couldn't speak Portuguese. I couldn't stand up and teach a class. As much as I wanted to, it wasn't going to happen. And so that forced me to basically identify individuals, leaders in the organization, and have them teach the class. So first I had to convince them that this was the right thing and had to give them the pen to design it. And then they drove it. And they took ownership and they drove it. And I never would have thought this coming in, but not being able to speak Portuguese was probably the best thing that could have happened for the program. And if I had been a guy that had come in and spoke fluent Portuguese, I would have tried to do it all myself, and it would not have been a success. Because I didn't, I was forced to engage with these guys, convince them first, and then give them the tools, and they rolled it out. And it was funny that we did this training. I'll never forget this. It was November. I'd been in Brazil for 11 months, and I'd been listening in Portuguese, but not really speaking. And I was so excited at the end of this 2-day sales training that I stood up and gave like 4 sentences in horrible Portuguese, saying how wonderful it was, how happy I was, and they all got up and clapped. So I think just to be gratuitous and make me feel better. But it was really, 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 really important. The other thing we did as we got further into this process is we created opportunities for accountability and to celebrate success. And so what does this mean? We did quarterly meetings to every plant. And so we built into those quarterly meeting decks highlights of what that local team was doing using these tools, after we had gotten everybody trained up. And so that local sales guy got to stand up in front of the president of the company, who was the only other American down there, Bob, and talk about their success. And that was really exciting for them. And it gave them an opportunity to share and feel proud. A lot of times they did in English so they could practice their English. And so that was the real positive side. On the flip side, they would also force accountability. They knew they had to get up and to present to the president. And so in a not unsuspecting way, forced them to actually execute the tool and build out the framework. And then we had something called the Convention de Ventas, the sales convention. Once a year, a big party, we bring all the salespeople together, and we would highlight the best cases from the year. And they would get up and stand up in front of their 200 peers and present. And we would really say, this is the best case study from this region or that region or that region. And that was huge. We measured outcomes with consistency and dashboards, right? So, what's measured improves. And so how do you quantify something like commercial excellence? It obviously, you've got incremental sales, but you've also got the building out the value proposition model, building out the presentation that shows the quantification of value that you can present to the customer. We actually started to track that. How many times have you done that? And it became part of our normal routine. And then I just got out of the way. I mean, honestly, it was 2 years of pretty intense work getting it set up, and then you just step back and you let the local team own it. And it was great. And they did it, and they really owned it, and they've continued to be successful. So that was kind of how it evolved. As I said, if I had tried to plan it this way, I never would have. I never would have thought of having to bring an Albanian in from Richmond to help me, because he spoke broken Italian. And I never would have done a lot of these things. So a lot of it was kind of situational, doing it on the fly, thinking about it, reacting to the moment, reading the room, talking to people, investing the time. Being humble is huge when you're in this type of situation. I think those were all the things that were successful. Notes on Ergus and Filagoy. So Ergus now works in the beverage business. He has lived in India and in Shanghai, and he now runs our Greater China and Southeast Asia business for our beverage business, which is really fun. Filagoy has now risen in higher and higher levels, was up here 2 weeks ago for training in Richmond, and has become one of our stars. So it didn't have anything to do with me per se, but it's fun to watch how these guys evolve in their careers. So some of my learnings, and then we could open it up for some questions. Really build the effort to outlast any individual. Okay, so what does that mean? I knew I was an expat, and I knew I was only going to be there for 3 years, and that's also probably one of the best things that could happen, right? I generally have found you need to go into a job preparing to, at any moment, be yanked out of that job. So if you really want to build change over time, you need to do it thinking about how do you have it be disconnected from you, right? You need it to be able to be gone in 2 weeks and have the effort continue on. And that obviously is easier as you get further into a change management process. But what I've always tried to do is build it to outlast any individual. And in this case, we did that. The importance of tropicalizing, what does that mean? So we use the term tropicalizing when we were in Brazil to talk about taking kind of US-based ideas and adapting them to Brazil, right? So I think I've had the opportunity to travel to and work in a lot of different countries, and I've found that if you try to say, this is the way we do it, and this is the playbook you're going to run, you're not necessarily going to be as successful. Taking it and putting it not only in their language, literally, but in how they talk about the business, how they think about the business, and adapting it for how business is done in those countries is really, really important. And that's something that we've found success in, not only with this, but in a lot of things. Repeatable processes ensure continuity. So, structure is how organizations function. I mean, to be completely honest, structure and processes are how big companies function. And that is what is different between a small startup where everybody's doing a little bit of everything and a large company that is not necessarily tied to any individual. So you can't, from my standpoint, you can't over-process things at the beginning because you'll lose people. Because they'll be like, oh my gosh, the number of times I heard the word bureaucracy when we were running this play down in Brazil was tremendous, because that had been the fear. So most times when folks had come down from the US to try to implement a program, it was all about bureaucracy. It's filling out spreadsheets, it's doing reports, it's meetings that are internal meetings where we talk to each other and we don't talk to the customer. But at the same time, you need to have those types of repeatable processes in order for something to be sustainable. And so think about how you build those in, again, so it outlasts you, but also so it can live on. Incentives aren't always financial. In Brazil, in our business there, unlike a lot of places, our sales team isn't commission based. So they all are on salary, and everybody participates in the same management incentive plan, the same variable plan. So literally every person in this organization in Brazil is paid on how that business does from an EBITDA or cash flow standpoint. So there's no chasing volume to win sales. They do this because they have pride in what they do. They do it because they want to beat the guy in the next desk or the next plant over. The competition in between plants is phenomenal. And they do it because they like to learn. And so for me, we actually worked to implement a more traditional sales incentive program when we were in Brazil, and it really didn't take off because it's just not how those folks are wired. And so that was a really interesting thing. When you read business literature, a lot of times just make sure you align the incentives with what you want to try to accomplish. Doesn't always necessarily have to be financial. And then the other learning, which was hard, was the concept that organizational structure can be hard to overcome. And just to spend a couple minutes on this one, one of the things that we tried to do was organize account leaders for some of those big accounts that reached across the entire country, right? And so you have one guy that owns X account, and he works across all 4 plants. Well, we were structured with kind of plant general managers, and so each guy was the director of a plant, and he had the region, he had the sales team, he had the operations. So when you try to have one individual that sits in, plant A, try to influence somebody who sits in plant B, even though their incentives had nothing to do with the profitability of the plant, the organizational structure was such that there was tension. They didn't necessarily want to do that because their boss, may or may not have been completely supportive. And so we tried to build a matrix structure, and it was really, really difficult to do that. Interestingly, right after I left, they blew up that structure, and they went to a commercial structure and an ops structure with one commercial leader and one ops leader. And I think part of it was to try to, and they reorganized around kind of national clusters around different industries or end markets. And that was because we had spent, at that point, 5 years trying to drive this kind of different commercial approach, and it just hadn't taken. And so now it's been successful. I mean, there are dozens of other learnings, big and small, but those were just a few that kind of popped out at me as I thought about it. Kind of the rest of the story. This is a slide from our last quarterly results call, which was a month or so ago, and I pulled this because I thought it kind of made me proud, because this was the output of what we started now 7 years ago. Brazil box shipments was up 16.5% year over year versus industry growth of 5%, right? So that is the proof that's in the pudding. Those guys are killing it. They're doing a great job. They're growing ahead of the market. Brazil right now, 2010 through 2013 and 14 were great years, and then there's been a lot of political instability and a lot of economic challenges in Brazil. But this team there, that's as strong as any team I've ever worked with, continues to perform in those challenges. I'd like to take credit for some of this. I know it's mostly the great work of the team down there, but it's I think testimony to the success that they've had in executing this differentiated play, because that's how you grow. So that's a real quick overview. I didn't want to dwell on too many of the details, but I'd like to open up for questions.
Just curious, who was the main driver for sustainability of change after you left? Because to keep it consistent, to keep the conferences going, to keep... That's a great question. So
I left. I was in Brazil for 5 years. I did this role for 2 years, and then I was the CFO for 3 more years. So really, after 2 years, I kind of had to hand it off when I became the CFO of the Brazilian organization. We initially, I was trying to remember what we did. I know where we ended up. We went through a couple of iterations, right? And so I think we initially gave it to one of the other directors as kind of his kind of side job in addition to running one of the plants. It kind of, that worked, but didn't work great.
He owned it?
And he owned it, but he owned the process, but he owned it as part of, he was running a big box plant. I think then they gave it to a manager that reported centrally, kind of into the divisional group. And he was able to continue to drive it and make forward progress, but not at the pace that they hoped. And then right as I left, they reorganized it into this commercial organization and this operations organization. And then they had a senior leader with all of commercial over top of underneath him. And they reorganized the structure underneath, and that allowed them to have that focus and to not have any kind of territorial issues between who owned what, and I think that's really, frankly, what's enabled them to take it to the next level.
Nice.
Yeah, so that's one where structure can have an impact, even with the best people. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about how incentive isn't always financial.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about potentially trying to get a traditional incentive for the sales force that wasn't as effective.
Right.
What did you find to be effective since it wasn't always about money?
Recognition was big. In recognition, not necessarily in the ways you would think. We never did something where we would call up and give people a trophy, but it was the little opportunities to highlight the good work that they had done in a group and have them, most often it was them presenting. That really was it. And then the pride associated with the competition between the plants was also really, really big. So and then within a plant you would have different sales offices, different subgroups within that plant, and they would compete against each other as well. But it was really kind of the opportunity to tell the story more broadly in front of their peers. Yeah.
Going kind of back to the beginning, sort of framed this investing in the plant as sort of relying on this change program being a success. Was that really the main condition of getting the financing, or?
No, it was a component. So this is one of the slides from the deck around the sources of value with the investment. So the investment was just really quick to help understand kind of the components of it. It was an investment in a new paper machine to grow our capacity of paper. We had basically grown outside of our own capacity, and so we were having to buy paper from our competitor. So there were basically 4 different drivers of value. One were the operational efficiency gains of just putting in a faster paper machine and some of the investments we made in the mill. That's this bar. One was avoiding third-party paper, so not buying paper from our competitor, but making it ourselves at a lower price. One was some technology around basis rate reduction, basically using less fiber to make the same paper. But then this one was the growth. So this was the corrugated growth. So it was arguably 25%, 20 to 25% of the overall value that we hope to gain from the project. And corrugated growth comes in a lot of ways. Initially, part of the view was corrugated growth could come through just overall market growth. Because Brazil, when we got there, was growing at a tremendous clip. That growth started to flatten out, and then going and gaining market share using these tools was going to be more important. There were about 5 of us that went down as part of this. There was a leader, a president of the overall organization. There was me focused on commercial. And then there were several engineers that were focused on the project to make sure we executed the project. So, questions, yeah?
You mentioned early on that one of the things that you observed when you first joined was that the team had a lot of legacy knowledge kind of built into the DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And then none of that was documented, or there was no game plan, nothing formalized.
Yep.
Can you elaborate on what you did to change that? Was there documentation that you said you guys would document this process so that there's that key man risk, right? When somebody
Yeah.
leaves and nobody knows how to do it.
Yeah, we did, and that actually was one of the hardest things to do because, knowledge to some extent is power, right? And knowledge also is what people feel like is their value. So we had to do it very carefully to not make somebody feel like we just wanted to, to steal what they did. The way I did it is I actually asked the team to build the playbook themselves. I said, listen, guys, I know you're really, really great at what you do, but we need to make sure that we can teach that to other people. And so I want you to develop a sales training where you take all that stuff that's in your head and you actually train this generation of sales folks and the next generation. And so it was a little bit of a way to get them to write it down because we had to prepare materials that we could use in the sales training. And that was a mechanism to try to capture some of the details. And it had the dual purpose of them owning it and crafting it the way they wanted to, but also for us getting the benefit of starting to capture some of that. One of the oldest of the old guard retired while we were down there, and he was initially his name was Milton. He was a little bit difficult to convince, but then once we convinced him, he became frankly one of our strongest advocates. He had been in the company when he retired for 46 years. I mean, and capturing 46 years of knowledge is frankly impossible, right? And he had trained, Philigoy was his guy, right? And he had a couple of others. But once we got him over that hump, then, everybody else kind of fell in behind because they looked to him as, kind of the godfather of the sales team. Right. But to answer your question, that's how we did it. I used this opportunity for them to build a training to kind of capture it and then tweak it.
So you talked a little bit about make it local.
Yep.
This is a fun question.
Okay.
I guess anything that you really enjoyed while you were in Brazil, and how you kind of got really into the culture.
Yeah, no, it was great. It is the weather's wonderful, and it was beautiful all the time, which was nice. So we did. It's a very social culture. So it was a very and when we were there were a lot of expats that had been sit down. So 2010, 2011 was a time where there was a lot of multinationals were pushing people into Brazil. And so we frankly had a great time just getting to know folks from different countries and then getting to know the Brazilians. I mean, it's an extremely laid back culture. It was just a lot of fun. I mean, it was a great place to raise a family. We have, I don't have as many kids as Matt, but I've got 4. And so come close. And one of them was born down there. And so that was just a great experience. So, and they're all the same age as his. They're all little. And so it was a wonderful experience. So when I was asked twice to re-up. So after the second year, they came to me and said, we need you to go back into finance. We need you to be the finance lead, but we need you to extend for a year. And we were like, absolutely, not even a question. And then the second time they asked, I pushed back a little bit, but not really, because that kept us here through the World Cup, which was fun.
My company has operations in Brazil too. He was down in the south. Mine are up in the north in Pará.
Yeah, there's good. Yeah.
But my takeaway is that the culture there is one of high engagement. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we talked about, the things that kill change management, is commitment. I have a hunch you probably didn't have to convince them that hard. I mean, these folks are passionate. They're proud, extremely proud. I mean, everyone wears the Brazil national soccer jersey. They're very proud of their plant. They're proud of their country. So when you say you're going to get the biggest investment our company's ever made in 46, I mean, that's going to immediately make them engaged and proud. And there probably wasn't a lot of convincing you need to do to get people to get on board with this.
No, I think that's a really good point. I mean,
Germans would have been different. Germans are much more.
Yeah, they embrace it. And the other thing that's interesting about Brazil is, you know, it's obviously a big country, but there are different pockets of Brazil. So Matt talked about Germans. You know, one of our plants here in the south was in a town called Blumenau in Santa Catarina that was basically founded by German immigrants. So literally the sales team spoke German amongst themselves in the office. They didn't speak Portuguese because that was the language they grew up with at home. We actually moved a guy from here in this plant down to here to be the sales manager, and his first rule was no more German. You got to speak Portuguese, so I know what you're saying. You know, up here in the state of Sao Paulo, this is the most developed area of Brazil. A lot of European influence, and then in the Northeast, it's much more. It's like a developing market. I mean, in a lot of ways, I mean, relatively, this is more like a developed market within Brazil, and the Northeast is like an emerging market. That's where Matt's plant is up there. I mean, that is literally, you know, shacks on the side of the road, very, very poor, you know, a completely different lifestyle, completely different expectations. And so managing across those, even that cultural diversity within a country was really fun and challenging. But the engagement was very, very high. I mean, the Brazilians, I like to say they don't know how to fail. I mean, honest to God, our team down there is as strong as anybody anywhere, and they just don't know how to fail. And they weren't going to fail. So, you know, in some ways it was an easy job. You kind of give them some tools, point them in the right direction. Like I said, get out of the way. You know, we had some challenges as we executed this project, but it ended up being a really big success. And the Brazilian operation continues to be a jewel, even in the new company, with really tremendous, you know, EBITDA margins and growth. So it was a fun thing to be a part of.
Did Rock 10 have Brazilian operations?
Rock 10 was basically a North America focused company, a little bit in Mexico, a little bit in Canada. So the merger was great because it provided, you know, a really good fit. We had obviously North America, but a lot of global operations. They were very interested in really expanding and becoming a global company. And so it was a really, really nice fit.
Everybody knows Mead, the Trapper Keeper.
Yeah.
Remember the Trapper Keeper?
That was
Adam Rock's the Trapper Keeper.
Yeah, so that was the consumer. So back then, we had 4 different businesses: packaging, which was paper and boxes; the Trapper Keeper, there, the consumer and office products business. We sold that several years ago, and then a chemicals business as well. So yeah, it's an interesting company to work for.
And in Brazil, I was telling them that this is good.
Yeah.
That's not good.
That's not so good. You don't do that. You learn that one came out of my repertoire pretty fast.
Any other questions for Adam? All right,
So that's the story.
Round of applause.
Thanks.
No, I'll take this. But okay, so oops, I got the doodad in your pocket.
Sorry.
So we'll wrap it tonight. Like I mentioned, Monday, 6:15, we'll all get on the Adobe Connect for a little conference call, and I'll walk you through the intro, and there's a video that explains the directions on the simulation. And I'll stay online as long as I can. I think my flight takes off. I'm flying to Norway on Monday when we have our next class, so we're going to do it online. So I will. I think my flight takes off at 8:40, something like that. So probably by about 8 o'clock, I'll have to make my way toward the gate. But from 6:15 till 7:30, 8 o'clock, I'll be online trying to help if there's any questions. If something really breaks down, I think you can call Harvard Business Publishing. They're open 24/7, but I know they won't reset it. So if you get halfway through the game and you're stinking it, and you just think, oh, I just want to start over, it won't let you do that. So you just got to push your way through it, okay? The final project instructions are online. Read that. The Buses for Democracy case online for the 12th. In the meantime, any questions, just let me know. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
I have one more question.
Yeah.